King Edward II, early reign, 1307 to 1311. Coronation and marriage. In 1307, King Edward I had once again prepared for a military campaign against Scotland, with his son, Prince Edward, expected to join the expedition later that summer. However, the aging monarch's health deteriorated significantly, and on July 7th, he passed away at Borough-by-Sands near the Scottish border. Upon receiving the news, Edward rushed from London and was formally proclaimed king on July 20th. Demonstrating an initial commitment to his father's campaign, Edward advanced into Scotland, where he received the homage of his Scottish supporters at Dumfries on August 4th. However, he soon abandoned the campaign and returned south, shifting his focus to consolidating his rule and securing his authority over the English court and nobility. One of Edward's earliest acts as king was the recall of his close confidant, Piers Gaveston, from exile. Gaveston had been a favourite of Edward's father but had fallen out of favour due to suspicions regarding his undue influence over the young prince. Ignoring his father's last wishes to keep Gaveston in exile, Edward not only reinstated him but also granted him the prestigious title of Earl of Cornwall, a position that came with considerable wealth and influence. Additionally, Edward arranged Gaveston's marriage to Margaret de Clare, a noblewoman from one of England's most powerful families, further cementing his ally's status. Gaveston quickly became a dominant figure at Edward's court, leading to resentment among the barons, who viewed him as an upstart with too much power. Edward also took steps against those he perceived as his father's adversaries. One of his key actions was the arrest of Bishop Walter Langton, the former Treasurer of England, whom Edward accused of financial mismanagement. Langton was dismissed from his post, signalling Edward's desire to remove officials closely associated with his father's administration. Meanwhile, Edward I's body was initially kept at Waltham Abbey before being transported to Westminster Abbey for burial. As a tribute to his late father, Edward commissioned a simple marble tomb, though it lacked the grandeur often associated with royal burials. His decision to keep the memorial modest may have been a reflection of financial considerations or a shift in priorities toward court politics and his personal relationships. In January 1308, Edward travelled to France to marry Isabella of France, the daughter of King Philip IV. The marriage was politically significant, as it was intended to strengthen Edward's position in Gascony and secure financial support. Before his departure, he made the controversial decision to appoint Gaveston as Custos Regni, keeper of the realm, effectively granting him sweeping authority to govern England in the king's absence. This move, which was reinforced by the creation of a specially engraved Great Seal for Gaveston's use, was highly unusual and provoked resentment among the English nobility. Many barons viewed this decision as proof of Edward's excessive favoritism and misjudgment in governance. Negotiating the terms of the marriage proved difficult, as Edward and Philip IV had a tense relationship. The French king demanded a generous dower for Isabella and imposed strict conditions regarding Edward's governance of his territories in France. Ultimately, Edward agreed to pay homage to Philip IV for the Duchy of Aquitaine and accepted the establishment of a commission to ensure the implementation of the 1303 Treaty of Paris. These negotiations revealed the broader geopolitical struggles between England and France, foreshadowing the tensions that would persist throughout Edward's reign. Edward and Isabella were wed in Boulogne on January 25, 1308. As a wedding gift, Edward presented Isabella with a richly decorated psalter, while Philip IV gifted his daughter valuables worth over 21,000 livres, including a fragment of the True Cross. The newlyweds returned to England in February, where Edward had overseen lavish preparations at Westminster Palace for their coronation and wedding celebrations. The palace was adorned with luxurious marble tables, 40 ovens to prepare an extravagant feast, and even a fountain that dispensed wine and pimento, a popular spiced medieval beverage. The sheer opulence of the event was seen by some as excessive, given the financial strains on the kingdom. The coronation took place on February 25 at Westminster Abbey, under the guidance of Henry Woodlock, the Bishop of Winchester. During the ceremony, Edward swore an oath to uphold the rightful laws and customs which the community of the realm shall have chosen. The significance of this pledge remains debated. Some historians suggest it was intended to bind Edward to accept future legislation, while others believe it was a means of appeasing the barons. The event was marred by the unruly behavior of the crowd, as a large number of eager spectators pushed their way into the palace, causing part of a wall to collapse and forcing Edward to flee through a back entrance. This chaotic scene set an ominous tone for Edward's reign, as it highlighted the growing unrest and dissatisfaction among his subjects. At the time of her marriage, Isabella was only 12 years old, a young age even by medieval standards. It is likely that Edward, like many kings of the period, engaged in extramarital affairs during the early years of his marriage. He is believed to have fathered an illegitimate son, Adam, who may have been born as early as 1307. Despite these challenges, Edward and Isabella later had 4 children together. Their firstborn, the future Edward III, was born in 1312 to widespread celebrations. He was followed by John in 1316, Eleanor in 1318, and Joan in 1321. The birth of Edward III was particularly significant, as it secured the Plantagenet line and provided stability to the monarchy, even as Edward II's rule grew increasingly turbulent. However, despite the marriage, tensions between Edward and Isabella would later emerge. Isabella found herself politically sidelined due to Edward's unwavering favoritism towards Gaveston and later other court favorites, leading to a gradual estrangement. This growing divide would later play a crucial role in the eventual downfall of Edward II's reign. His inability to balance personal relationships with his royal duties would contribute to political instability and deepening divisions within the English nobility. Edward's early reign set the stage for the conflicts that would define his rule. His reliance on favorites, disregard for baronial concerns, and growing financial difficulties created an unstable political landscape. While he demonstrated moments of strategic acumen, particularly in securing his marriage alliance, his failure to manage relationships with the nobility would prove to be his greatest weakness. The period from 1307 to 1311 marked a time of both promise and controversy, foreshadowing the tumultuous years to come in his reign. Tensions over Gaveston. The return of Piers Gaveston from exile in 1307 was initially accepted by the English barons, but their tolerance quickly soured. Gaveston's undue influence over King Edward II became a point of deep contention within the nobility. Chroniclers of the time described it as if 2 kings were reigning in one kingdom, one in name and the other in deed. Whether true or not, allegations began to surface that Gaveston had misappropriated royal funds and had taken personal possession of wedding gifts meant for Queen Isabella of France. His presence at Edward's coronation only further incensed the nobility, particularly the French delegation, who viewed his lavish clothing, ceremonial precedence, and the king's open preference for his company over Isabella's as an outright insult. By February 1308, tensions had escalated to a crisis. When Parliament assembled, Edward aimed to discuss broader governmental reforms, but the barons made it clear that no such discourse could proceed until Gaveston was removed. The hostility in the chamber threatened to spill over into violence. Henry de Lacy, the respected and politically moderate Earl of Lincoln, intervened, persuading the barons to avoid open conflict for the time being. Yet this was a temporary reprieve, as a fresh parliament was convened in April, and the opposition to Gaveston had only intensified. Queen Isabella and her powerful French allies now joined the English barons in demanding his exile. Facing mounting pressure from all sides, Edward conceded and agreed to send Gaveston to Aquitaine, where he would be out of reach of his detractors. To ensure compliance, the Archbishop of Canterbury issued a warning of excommunication should Gaveston return. Edward, however, was unwilling to part with his favoured companion so easily. At the last moment, he changed course, appointing Gaveston as Lord Lieutenant of Ireland and sending him to Dublin instead. This allowed Gaveston to retain both status and influence while technically fulfilling the exile order. Meanwhile, Edward's plans for a renewed Scottish campaign were quietly abandoned, as political tensions at home took precedence. By August 1308, the focus had shifted entirely toward negotiations for governmental reform. Despite Gaveston's official removal, Edward worked relentlessly to engineer his return. Behind the scenes, he launched diplomatic appeals to Pope Clement V and King Philip IV of France, offering sweeping concessions in exchange for their support. Among these, he pledged to suppress the Knights Templar in England and release Bishop Walter Langton from imprisonment. Edward also sought to rally his own loyalists within England, arranging secret meetings with key barons and church officials throughout early 1309. By spring, a formidable opposition bloc had emerged, likely led by Thomas, Earl of Lancaster, one of the most powerful nobles in the realm. In an effort to reassert his authority, Edward convened another session of Parliament. The barons remained united in their opposition, refusing to approve Gaveston's return. However, they did propose a compromise. If Edward agreed to an extensive program of political reforms, they would grant him additional taxation to finance military operations in Scotland. Unwilling to sever his ties with Gaveston, but also aware of the financial necessity of securing funds, Edward offered assurances to the Pope that the dispute over Gaveston had been resolved, arguing that procedural irregularities had tainted the original exile decree. His appeals succeeded. Clement V annulled the threat of excommunication, opening the door for Gaveston's return. By June 1309, Gaveston was back in England, and Edward publicly welcomed him with great enthusiasm. The nobility, however, saw this as an act of outright defiance. When Parliament reconvened in July, Edward was left with no choice but to make substantial concessions. To placate his opponents, he agreed to curtail the powers of the royal steward and the marshal of the household, regulate the unpopular royal practice of purveyance, and repeal newly enacted customs duties. In return, Parliament granted Edward new taxes to fund the Scottish war effort. Though this appeared to be a successful compromise, it merely served as a temporary truce. The underlying tension surrounding Gaveston's unchecked influence and Edward's unwillingness to listen to his nobles festered in the realm's political stability. Over the following months, Gaveston resumed his dominant role at court, exacerbating the resentment of the nobility. Many barons viewed him as an arrogant upstart who openly mocked and belittled them. His penchant for bestowing insulting nicknames upon powerful lords, including the influential Earl of Lancaster, only deepened their animosity. His behavior, combined with Edward's unwavering devotion to him, ensured that opposition would only grow stronger. While Edward may have hoped that the concessions he made in 1309 would secure peace, the reality was that his defiance in bringing Gaveston back had irreparably damaged his relationship with the barons. As tensions continued to escalate, many noblemen saw Gaveston's unchecked power not merely as an affront to their own influence, but as a genuine threat to the kingdom's governance. By 1310, the opposition had coalesced into a powerful faction, determined to act decisively against both Edward and his favored companion. The fragile truce forged in 1309 was already unraveling, setting the stage for the next chapter of conflict in Edward II's turbulent reign. The Ordinances of 1311, a turning point in Edward II's reign. Following his return to England, Piers Gaveston found his relationship with the major barons increasingly strained. His arrogance and blatant disregard for noble decorum led to deep-seated tensions, as he frequently insulted prominent figures, including referring to one of the most powerful earls as the Dog of Warwick. These reckless actions only exacerbated existing hostilities, particularly with the Earl of Lancaster and his faction, who viewed Gaveston as an unworthy favourite enjoying undue influence over the king. The situation reached a boiling point in 1310 when Lancaster and his allies refused to attend Parliament, citing Gaveston's continued presence as an insurmountable obstacle to meaningful governance. Compounding Edward II's difficulties, the crown was facing severe financial troubles. The king was indebted to his Italian bankers, the Frescobaldi, for an overwhelming sum of £22,000, a debt that weighed heavily on his administration. His increasingly desperate methods of raising revenue, particularly through the highly unpopular right of prizes, led to widespread dissatisfaction among the nobility and commoners alike. Attempts to raise an army for the Scottish campaign were met with resistance, as the nobility, wary of Gaveston's undue influence over military affairs, suspended the collection of new taxes. The collapse of military preparations only further fueled unrest among the barons, who saw Edward's favouritism as a direct threat to the stability of the realm. Parliament convened in February 1310, ostensibly to discuss Scotland's escalating military threat, but debate quickly shifted to the kingdom's internal crises. The barons, weary of Edward's reliance on Gaveston and alarmed by his continued failure to address governance issues, petitioned the king to remove him as a chief advisor. In his place, they proposed governance by a council of 21 elected barons, known as the Ordainers, who would be tasked with implementing widespread reforms aimed at limiting royal excess and restoring baronial influence. Under immense pressure, Edward had no choice but to acquiesce. The Ordainers represented a diverse political coalition, composed of both reformists and conservatives, ensuring that their eventual reforms would not be radical but would still impose significant limitations on the king's authority. As the Ordainers deliberated on their policies, Edward and Gaveston embarked on another military campaign to Scotland, leading an army of approximately 4,700 troops. However, the campaign was an unmitigated disaster, as Robert the Bruce refused open battle, preferring to employ guerrilla tactics that left the English forces exhausted and demoralized. With supplies dwindling and funds exhausted, Edward was forced to abandon the campaign and return south in 1311, his authority weakened and his political position even more precarious than before. His inability to achieve any meaningful success in Scotland further eroded confidence in his leadership. Upon his return, Edward faced the reality of the Ordainers' reforms, now formalized as the Ordinances of 1311. These new laws imposed severe restrictions on the monarchy, fundamentally altering the balance of power between the king and the nobility. The king was prohibited from engaging in warfare or granting land without parliamentary approval, ensuring that military and economic decisions would be subject to broader scrutiny. Parliament gained oversight of royal administration, curtailing the king's ability to act unilaterally and ending arbitrary financial practices such as prizes. The Frescobaldi bankers were expelled from handling royal finances, severing Edward's reliance on foreign creditors and reinforcing domestic control over the crown's financial matters. Mechanisms were also put in place to monitor and enforce adherence to the ordinances, ensuring that the reforms were more than just symbolic gestures. Perhaps most significantly, the ordinances mandated the permanent exile of Gaveston. Unlike his previous exiles, which had been temporary and largely symbolic, this decree was absolute. He was banned from residing anywhere within Edward's dominions, including Gascony and Ireland, and was stripped of his titles and lands. This represented a major victory for the barons, who had long sought to rid the kingdom of his influence. However, Edward was deeply affected by Gaveston's exile, viewing it as a personal betrayal rather than a necessary political concession. Following these developments, Edward withdrew to his estates at Windsor and King's Langley, isolating himself from court affairs as he struggled to come to terms with the limitations imposed upon him. Meanwhile, Gaveston departed England, possibly seeking refuge in northern France or Flanders. Yet, despite his forced departure, tensions between the king and the barons remained unresolved. Edward's simmering resentment over the ordinances and Gaveston's exile would continue to shape his rule, setting the stage for further political strife, rebellion, and a prolonged struggle between the monarchy and the nobility. The events surrounding the ordinances of 1311 marked not only a pivotal moment in Edward II's reign but also a critical juncture in England's broader constitutional history, highlighting the growing influence of Parliament and the increasing limitations placed upon monarchical authority. Thanks for listening. Like, comment, and subscribe to Medieval Chronicles 1066 for more journeys back to the Middle Ages. Stay curious.